tonight. An investigation of the controversial use of amphetamines by U.S. fighter pilots and the friendly fire incident in Afghanistan, where 4 Canadian soldiers lost their lives.
The fighter pilot would say, speed is life, speed is life. Well, in this case, speed became death.
The use of amphetamines and other drugs by military personnel is really the dirty secret that the Air Force and the military has.
The Passionate Eye presents The Need for Speed, Going to War on Drugs.
Hello, I'm Michael Jean. Welcome to The Passionate Eye. Last week, the family of one of the victims in the so-called friendly fire incident in Afghanistan announced they would file a claim against the U.S. government. The $2 million case seeks compensation for the death of Private Richard Green of Mill Cove, Nova Scotia, one of 4 Canadian soldiers who died in the tragic event. 8 more were wounded. In tonight's documentary, Irish filmmaker Jamie Doran follows the case of the 2 U.S. fighter pilots who were under investigation for bombing the Canadian troops. Their defense: they were flying under the influence of amphetamines supplied by the U.S. Air Force. They are not alone. The Need for Speed examines the routine use of drugs by U.S. soldiers and pilots going into combat and the deadly consequences.
For over 30 years in cities and towns throughout the nation, America has been fighting what is officially known as the war on drugs. What's largely unknown until now is that during that time, America's armed forces has been going to war on mind-altering narcotics. Amphetamines, known to drug addicts worldwide as speed, are regularly given to U.S. servicemen going into battle. Today, the Pentagon finally admits giving the drugs, but insists they're safe.
This is fact. We have never found anyone to have suffered any kind of adverse effect from it.
Not according to U.S. servicemen who, despite fear of recrimination in a country obsessed with security and secrecy, are willing to describe the true effects of war fought on drugs.
Claustrophobic, I was almost going to say schizophrenic.
I was dancing. If you could dance in a small cockpit, I was close enough. I was about as close as you can get to it.
You killed people under the influence of drugs.
Yes.
Drugs given to you by the military.
Yes.
In the Hollywood movie Top Gun, Tom Cruise cries out, "I have a need for speed." The American military has been taking his words literally for years. April 2003, southern Iraq. Just a few hundred feet above a British convoy, an American A-10 tank-buster aircraft begins circling. There should be no reason for concern as the vehicles have bright identification marks and national flags painted on the sides.
I noticed it was an American plane, but I didn't want to believe it was because it's friendly, isn't it?
Only 50 feet above the ground on a perfectly clear day, the A-10 attacks, then circles to prepare for a second run.
When I saw the pilot's face the second time he came round, I spotted it was an A-10. And it was a bit hard to, I don't know, it was weird.
Inexplicably, the plane attacks again. Trooper Finney is injured and his friend, Lance Corporal Matty Hull, killed. One soldier in his unit called the pilot a cowboy. Another said, "My friends used to joke that it wasn't the Iraqis I had to worry about, it's the Americans."
On the face of it, the circumstances, if you've got good visibility in an aircraft which, like the A-10, is designed to do visual identification of targets, gets fairly close to the target as well, so it gives you plenty of time to look at it. On the face of it, these events should not happen.
The British are angry because this wasn't the first time, and they now know that US pilots are routinely issued with what they call go pills, dexedrine amphetamines.
There's a dream that's born when you're young and you want to be in that airplane, and then once you're experiencing the thrill of flying, you can't ever get away from it. You want to be back there every moment that you can.
Lieutenant Colonel Tom Heemstra was an Air Force top gun in every sense of the word. In a military career spanning 20 years, he flew over 3,000 hours, 15 combat missions, and reached the ultimate goal, becoming commander of an F-16 fighter squadron.
The freedom that you feel in the airplane, the control that you have over a supersonic, thunderous jet and all the power that comes with that is incredible.
But when Heemstra informed Congress about the military's policy of applying drugs and vaccines on his men, the Air Force set out to destroy his career.
The punishment was to being forced to resign as squadron commander or be fired. So I resigned. Of course, the congressman heard about that I was put in a position where I was punished in a violation of whistleblower laws. They asked me to come to Washington to testify.
This time, the Air Force grounded him, and after a third trip to Washington, he was forced to retire. Heemstra began to write a book about the military's use of the anthrax vaccine, and in the process, he obtained his medical records. There, amongst a whole list of drugs, was dexedrine.
I was kind of shocked, and then as I read those documents, I was even more shocked to find out the list of symptoms. You know, back then I was just a young gung-ho pilot, but now I think, you know, you put that all in a cockpit environment and under these kind of, in the wartime conditions, and you go, I'm not sure that compounded these effects would be very good for a pilot who has having to make decisions of life or death that are affecting people on the ground in terms of life or death.
Dexedrine is a Schedule II controlled narcotic, just below heroin and on a par with morphine and cocaine. According to the manufacturer, known side effects include palpitations, high blood pressure, dizziness, euphoria, dysphoria, headaches, insomnia, and hyperactivity. Normally prescribed for people suffering psychological problems, even driving a car can be a hazardous activity while under the influence. But imagine that car was an adrenaline-pumping $40 million combat aircraft flying at twice the speed of sound.
At high doses, they can lead to addiction, where people really get hooked and strung out on them, and where they can become paranoid, unable to sleep, for example. People will have runs of amphetamines where they'll stay awake for several days and be extremely crazy, including violent behavior.
They took them like it was candy. And I remember, you know, and just, I assume just because we were flying so much and we didn't have any kind of schedule at all that helped our bodies, that I know of one guy that almost got hooked on them. He was asking for them all the time.
In Washington, the revelation that its armed forces are fighting wars using drug stimulants has come as a shock.
Here we have a major effort on the part of our government at all levels to fight the distribution, the use, the trafficking in mind-altering drugs such as amphetamines and methamphetamines. And while we're doing that, on the other hand, the government seems to be encouraging the use of these illicit, illegal substances by our military.
Was the military's use of amphetamines a factor in the friendly fire deaths of recent wars? And was the official issue of these drugs responsible for any of the thousands of civilians killed by bombs in Iraq, Kosovo, and Afghanistan? Inevitably, though, it's when you kill your own allies that you begin to suspect that something could be very wrong.
Well, I didn't really think about it very seriously until the friendly fire incident where the Canadian troops were killed by one of our F-16 fighter pilot elements there in the war.
These Canadian soldiers had arrived in Afghanistan to support the international effort against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. 4 left in coffins, victims of friendly fire. But this was no ordinary accident of war. incident took place in the early hours of April 18, 2002. The two American pilots on night patrol believe the Canadian Army exercise is actually an attack on their planes by Taliban forces on the ground. This is the actual voice recording.
Okay, I've got some men on a road, and it looks like a piece of artillery firing at us. I am rolling in self-defense.
A 500-pound bomb is primed.
Bombs away, cranking left. Lasers on.
The explosion can be seen bottom left.
Shack.
Suddenly, the controller aboard the reconnaissance plane issues a warning.
Disengage. Friendlies can't harm. Can you confirm that they were shooting at us? Boss man, you cleared self-defense.
Wow. I hope that was the right thing to do. Me too.
It wasn't. Sergeant Ford lost his right eye in the explosion, and his leg was shattered. He will never see active duty again.
The only people that really know what happened are the two pilots, exactly, if they were right or wrong. I mean, I know from being on the receiving end that a huge mistake was made. We lost 4 of our, outstanding soldiers, and we should never, that should not have happened.
The two American F-16 pilots involved were Major Bill Umbach on the left and Major Harry Schmidt, who fired the missile. They'd been given Dexedrine Go pills prior to the flight, which the Air Force claims are simply mild stimulants to keep pilots awake and alert during long missions.
We trust our aviators with high-risk missions, high-value equipment, life or death decisions. We provide them this as a tool with medical advice under prescription from a physician, and then we trust their judgment.
They may trust their aviators, but they clearly don't trust journalists who might ask awkward questions, because we didn't actually conduct that interview. Instead, we waited in a car park where a package containing a videotape was delivered to us. No one was available even to talk about general policy, and we had no opportunity to challenge the experts on this tape. This is why the Air Force gives drugs to its pilots, courtesy of Armed Forces Television.
It serves the purpose. Gets you through that valley of fatigue, keeps your performance at an acceptable standard. There's no drug-like effect. It simply allows you to fight through the fatigue and fly normally.
Our program is safe and effective. We know it's safe because we've never had an attributable causal occurrence that has been shown to be related to the stimulant.
But as anger grew in Canada over the friendly fire deaths, in late 2002, the Pentagon announced a military hearing to determine whether the pilots should face courts-martial. Conviction could result in up to 64 years in prison. But why single out this case when there had been so many similar incidents in previous wars? A Canadian Board of Inquiry had already found that the actions of the pilots were the primary cause for the injuries and death, and concluded there had been a failure of airmanship and technique. But the board did not know the pilots, Umbach and Schmidt, had been issued with amphetamines and would use this as a major part of their defense, a factor the Pentagon had hoped would remain secret. When defense lawyers for the pilots raised this issue at the hearing, a furore broke out. They claimed the drugs had never been properly tested and that their clients' judgment had been affected under the influence of speed.
There's never been cases where it's been tested in stressful environments like in an emergency to determine whether or not it has a judgment impairing effect. We know that it does have a judgment impairing effect for people, for example, who are driving. So it would stand to reason that there would be a judgment impairing effect for somebody operating under stress in an aircraft.
Nobody knows what the effect is. And yes, maybe these go-no-go pills were tested in a peacetime environment under very controlled conditions, but that's nothing compared to these. We're talking very extreme battle conditions.
Neither pilot can speak publicly, but Bob Umbach, Bill's brother, and a fireman in Springfield, Illinois, is convinced his brother would never have taken the narcotics had he been given a choice.
Bill, growing up, never did drugs. You know, none of us did. That was just terrible. Now, in a certain sense, Bill and Harry were Bill and Harry were forced to take drugs. My understanding is you take the drugs or you don't go on the mission. He believes that the drugs are a factor in this. To what extent, nobody can know. Harry may not know. Bill may not know for sure. But yeah, I think the drugs are a factor of impairing judgment. And there were judgment calls made.
First off, the Air Force is completely in compliance with all federal laws, regulations, and policies for the dispensing of all medications in the Air Force.
But using dexedrine to combat fatigue runs contrary to the U.S. Food and Drugs Administration, which has not approved dexedrine for that purpose. This, in effect, makes it an experimental drug as used by the Air Force.
Federal law says that when you're using an experimental drug like these pilots were given, that you're supposed to be provided informed consent. And that informed consent means that the Air Force is required to tell you about all the risks of that drug. And the Air Force didn't do that in this case.
But the Air Force does provide its men with informed consent forms, which they must sign before receiving dexedrine. Although some side effects are listed, including insomnia, nervousness, and addiction, the word amphetamine is nowhere to be found. One word that does appear is voluntary.
It is completely voluntary, and I think there's some misinformation out there on that. On the consent form, where aircrew members acknowledge that they're receiving advice and the prescription of go pills, in 6 places on the form it says that it's voluntary. It also says in our directive, the message that the Air Force headquarters have put out, that the use must be emphasized as voluntary. It's a voluntary program.
But at the bottom of the consent form it states, should I choose not to take it under circumstances where its use appears indicated, I understand safety considerations may compel my commander, upon advice of the flight surgeon, to determine whether or not I should be considered unfit to fly a given mission.
There's an unspoken coercion that's taking place, and that pilots are expected to use the drug because it maintains their performance and ensures that they'll not be falling asleep over their mission objective. But in reality, if pilots don't take the drug, that means that they're not going to be given operational tasking orders, they're not going to be allowed to fly, and quite frankly, it's going to be reflected poorly in their records.
I would never not take a go pill. If I knew my squadron commander wouldn't have put me on that mission that first night or any other night, I'd say, give me the go pill. I'll take the go pill and I'll go get the mission done.
If you were told that you had to take a substance or you don't fly, what would be the reaction amongst the other pilots and yourself?
Well, that's an immediate no-brainer. I mean, we're going to do whatever it takes to stay in the cockpit.
You would just go to the flight surgeon and you carried a baggie, and he would just give you however many go pills you wanted. He'd just scoop them in there, and so you were always carrying, you know, probably at least 10, 20 go pills, and you just took them as needed. You could take them when you were flying, when you weren't flying.
Schmidt and Umbach were not the only airmen to experience problems the Air Force claims don't exist. Steve Tate is a hero of Desert Storm, famed for shooting down the first Iraqi MiG fighter on the opening night of the war. In the air or on the ground following a mission, his reaction to the amphetamine was extreme.
I guess I best remember it as almost paranoia. I felt, you know, I had a dizziness. I felt, you know, I wasn't like falling over dizzy, but there was a little bit of a tumbling sensation going on. I felt paranoia where I was just, you know, I was nervous and skittish about what was around me, what was happening. I wasn't in complete control.
Tate took far fewer of the pills than most of his squadron, 5 milligrams every 4 hours, the very dose recommended by the military.
For me, it was pretty much the same symptoms, just being claustrophobic, not, I was almost going to say schizophrenic.
What about your colleagues? Some suffered more than others.
Correct. We had, you know, some guys in the squadron that they were taking them like candy.
We know that a sense of paranoia might come about from taking these drugs, so that may make you a little more edgy, like you think you're getting shot at a little quicker than what you were. And it might just lead to rash decisions or quicker decisions that don't have the full judgment that you need in combat.
The U.S. military has generally been reluctant to provide detailed information on incidents of friendly fire, particularly when it comes to talking about its secretive drugs program. The worst example of recent years occurred in the 1991 Gulf War. A British armoured column is travelling through the Iraqi desert when A-10 American aircraft spot what they think is enemy traffic below. They're warned by a British Tornado flying nearby that these could be friendly troops. But the warning is ignored as the A-10s fire Maverick missiles into the armoured convoy. Nine soldiers died in the attack, 12 were injured, the largest single British loss during the entire Gulf War.
When I first got Stephen's death certificate, it had on it, killed in action, died in Saudi Arabia. Well, obviously I thought that he had been badly injured and flown back to Saudi Arabia and died there.
At the beginning, when the initial reports came back from the Gulf, was that it was one vehicle out on its own that had lost its markings in a sandstorm and it had been hit by friendly fire. Now, I must admit, we could accept that. We thought, well, accidents do happen.
But then they discovered the truth.
It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd been stationary for about 10, 15 minutes, stretching their legs, and clear blue sky, and these planes just came out and shot them.
Angry parents pursued the American representative at the funeral to demand the pilots come to Britain.
Hey, I'm one of the parents. Why can't the Americans send us the information? Why can't the pilots come over?
A spokesman in Washington made it clear that wouldn't happen.
That would merely compound the grief surrounding this event, which is something obviously in which they share. And finally, we just don't believe that sending the pilots there would add any new information.
President Bush gave assurances to parents of those killed servicemen that the pilots would come over here for examination. Will he tell us what representations he's made to make sure that President Bush carries out his assurances?
My right honourable friend...
Today, both the British authorities and the parents are still waiting for answers to crucial questions. Would you like to know if the American pilots who bombed the Fusiliers in Gulf War I were taking drugs?
It's essential that one knows whether they were taking drugs, what the drugs were, what the research data is in terms of the effects of those drugs on piloting ability.
But the American authorities won't tell us.
The American authorities have been remarkably reluctant to share the information that's required. The government should press them. We find ourselves increasingly in alliance operations with the United States in all sorts of difficult circumstances. We have been remarkably good allies in this, and the government needs as one of the prices for the way that we support American operations to make sure that we have that information available, and it should press strongly for it.
In fact, the US Air Force's own figures suggest it's likely the men who killed the British soldiers were on drugs. According to an internal Pentagon document we obtained, a survey of American pilots in Desert Storm showed that almost 60% took dexedrine. But in the units most heavily involved in combat, the rate was as high as 96%. The Royal Air Force firmly rejects the idea of allowing its pilots to operate under the influence of drugs.
Any British RAF pilot or any British military pilot indeed I think any British civil pilot as well, who was found to be taking any substances, be they alcohol or drugs, that were in their bloodstream when they were flying and were tested positive, would find themselves grounded, and I would imagine after an investigation would be thrown out of the military service they were in.
And the British may be interested to know that amphetamines were banned by the US Air Force soon after the Gulf War. It followed strong rumors from inside the American military that entire squadrons were having to be grounded due to pilots becoming addicted to dexedrine. Now chairman of an arms contractor in Orlando, Florida, it was then US Air Force Chief of Staff General Merrill McPeak who took the decision.
I had no science, no data. I just felt that we were highly trained people in good physical condition, and we didn't need any of this sort of artificial help to go beat the living bejesus out of somebody, which is what we're supposed to be doing. That's our job. I believe strongly in a warrior ethos. The fighter pilots are certainly, you know, at the front row of that. And so I believe that involves a certain approach, a code of conduct for your own daily behavior, whatever, however you want to say it. And taking amphetamines did not meet my personal standards.
But in 1996, after his retirement, Go pills were reintroduced and have been issued in every war since. When the pills were reintroduced, the Air Force guaranteed strict monitoring.
This is rigorously controlled with more checks and balances on this program than any other pharmaceutical, you know, that the Air Force uses.
The question is, are the pills collected? Do they accumulate somewhere? Are the pilots also using them in other contexts? Do you have people who are starting use in this way and then extending that use into a drug abuse context? I think those all become unintended consequences that should be carefully monitored.
Was this the case with Majors Umbach and Schmidt in Afghanistan?
In this case, the drugs weren't monitored very carefully. They weren't even collected after the flights.
And amphetamines aren't the only weapon in the Air Force's drugs arsenal. If a pilot goes up, he has to come down, and sedatives or no-go pills such as Ambien were issued to induce sleep.
The use of amphetamines to stay awake, coupled with the use of Ambien, for example, to bring the pilot down after the mission, and that's what the routine was. You take a quote-unquote amphetamine go pill to keep you awake during the flight, and when you get back, it's time to go to sleep, so you have to take a downer drug, like an Ambien. And the net effect of that is like speedballing. It's like what addicts do on the street, but it's very dangerous.
Speedballing, taking downers in order to feel the enormous high of the next amphetamine. Nobody knows, least of all the Air Force, what the cumulative effects are on pilots in combat. Are pilots like Umbach and Schmidt victims themselves? A growing number of American veterans believe so.
Hi, everybody, this is Dave Von Kleist.
And Joyce Riley.
And we all know that knowledge is power. That's why we call this the Power Hour!
Dave Von Kleist and Joyce Riley host a radio program aimed at veterans across the nation from their home in Missouri.
And what do we got going now, Joyce?
Well, unfortunately, those of you who have been following the Schmidt-Umbach case are going to be disappointed to find out that the news is that there is no news. In fact, the military has decided they're going to hold it in limbo. They're not moving forward now. Those of you who wonder what this case is all about, if you haven't been joining us on a regular basis, the major Schmidt and Umbach case is involving the go pills and no-go pills. They were given go pills. They were given, unfortunately, uppers, basically, to do their mission with, and downers at night.
In other words, they go off and they got to do a mission. They've got to stay up for hours, and they take one of these pills, and they go faster, 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 faster. And after they're done, they got to get some sleep. So they take another pill. They got to get them to slow down a little bit, and then they'll go to sleep.
I feel it's a very unfair situation. I think that they're having been given drugs. They're having been put into this scenario of no choice, and which I believe it is no choice. I know how the military works. I've been there. I mean, I know that when you order somebody to take a drug, they take the drug. And even though they sign an informed consent, that means absolutely nothing.
Captain Riley, a senior nurse during Desert Storm, now helps veterans recover from drugs given during wartime.
It's not just pilots, but it's a lot of different people, a lot of different professions in the military. And what they report is a lot of aggression, the fear that goes along with that, always being constantly on the edge. They call it increased vigilance, and it's very frightening to them. So they end up in, many times, this dreamlike state and can't tell whether it's the drug or themselves that are really creating the act.
In fact, some are given a whole cocktail of drugs, including anti-nerve agents, anthrax vaccines, and even adrenaline, in addition to amphetamines and sedatives. One soldier we interviewed admits he killed innocent people while under the influence.
They made you ruthless, just utterly ruthless. I made decisions that I feel now I would not have made. I eliminated individuals who I normally would not have, that I considered them to be a threat, that I would have not normally to have been a threat.
During recent wars, Mike fought as a soldier in one of the United States Elite Special Forces units. We cannot tell you which unit and have distorted his voice.
There were things that you put out of your mind. You push into a dark corner where the cobwebs grow, so that you don't have to think about it.
Did you become more aggressive?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
And the results?
During or after?
During.
During, they made me very brutal. They were just, they made you do things that I don't know if other normal human beings would do.
You killed people under the influence of drugs?
Yes.
Drugs given to you by the military?
Yes.
Amongst those he killed were women and children. Again, we can't give you exact details, as this would identify him to his former unit commanders.
You were on edge all the time. It was almost to the point of paranoia. You were ready to lash out at anything and everything. Almost to the point of hatred.
There are circumstances when casualties do count.
I, along with all the rest of America, grieve for the loss of life in Afghanistan. 3 of our soldiers were killed by an inadvertent bomb, and our prayers and sympathies go to the families. And I want the families to know that they died for a noble and just cause.
In Afghanistan and Iraq, a total of over 5,000 civilians have perished in bomb attacks since 2001. This number didn't include 18 killed in a convoy made up of Kurds, foreign press teams, and even American special forces traveling through northern Iraq in broad daylight. Amongst the dead, a member of a BBC team whose vehicle had been clearly marked before the attack. But the Pentagon insists issuing amphetamines is still best for the pilot himself.
This drug is safe for him, no side effects, it's safe for him, and with the desired effect. That is exactly the way the Air Force's program is designed to work, and is in the highest ideals and traditions of Air Force medicine supporting the warriors, getting the mission done, and returning home safely.
The bottom line is that U.S. forces are being kept awake and given an aggressive edge, given that little bit of whatever that will allow them to stay awake longer and to conduct operations more effectively. And if that's by keeping them up for long periods of time by using drugs, then frankly the American military is willing to do that.
Combating fatigue is relatively innocent when you say it in that fashion. But when you mask it or you create something that's going to overdrive the body and the system and the brain and the mind, then you've entered into a very, very dangerous arena.
In Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Heemstra continues to fight, to tell the story the Pentagon doesn't want heard.
It is very democratic to raise questions. Of course, the military is not a democracy, but we all, just with our basic common sense, would raise the question, well, what is this that you want me to put into my body? And so everybody has the right to ask that question. We've seen this before, whether it's radiation test or nuclear testing or Agent Orange, or whether it's Dexedrine or anthrax vaccine. The military is a captive audience, and we're used as guinea pigs for these pharmaceuticals.
Essentially, when you sign on the dotted line, you've given your life away. They require that you take certain drugs that they believe will ensure your combat effectiveness.
We were just dumb pilots, you know. I had to assume that somewhere along the road, that somewhere, someplace, they were tested, or they wouldn't be giving them to us. Now, whether that's naivety on my part or not, I don't know. But they didn't tell us that they were tested. But then again, we were just the dumb pilots.
Bill Umbach and Harry Schmidt had taken the drugs given them that fateful night in Afghanistan. The Air Force insists those drugs had no effect and bad airmanship was to blame. But the military has never investigated the dual effects of go pills and natural adrenaline brought on through battle. In recent days, Dr. Eric Heiligenstein, Director of Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin, who has studied amphetamine abuse in extreme circumstance, said, an individual can be stimulated considerably by the effects of battle, and the compounded effects of adding amphetamines can make someone go over the edge.
The amount of drugs that Bill and Harry were taking were, I think, 5 and 10 milligrams respectively. I think Bill on the 5 and Harry on the 10 milligrams, which I think were taken up to possibly an hour or a little less prior to the incident.
So the pilot who killed the 4 Canadian soldiers had taken 10 milligrams, exactly the same amount as the pilot who admitted in our film that he'd lost control of his faculties.
I was wired for about the next 15 hours.
Dr. Heiligenstein also stated that he wasn't at all surprised that this man lost control on just 10 milligrams. In late June 2003, Harry Schmidt was given an ultimatum by the Air Force: accept a criminal record and be thrown out of the military, or face courts-martial with the threat of imprisonment. He's decided to take that risk and fight for his name. Bill Umbach is leaving the Air Force.
I don't want Bill's career to be over. A fighter pilot, he hasn't had his last flight. Their last flight, they get to go out and do something really great. Didn't happen. They haven't been out there.
For the Canadian relatives, the pain is far greater. After the military's announcement, one widow said simply, "Nothing can bring my husband back to me." Those words are echoed in war-ravaged areas around the globe. As new conflicts involving American forces increasingly spring up, countless innocent civilians and even its own soldiers and airmen remain at risk from the Pentagon's policy that a war fought on drugs is a better war.
We're fighting for basic human rights around the world, and yet we're taking advantage, exploiting our own military troops, treating them like experimental guinea pigs, and just telling them to take these things because I said so.
I did some what people consider horrible things. in the name of God and country. But I was willing to accept the responsibility for those things. I accept them today. But when my government will not stand behind me and those like me, when the side effects become known, that troubles me greatly. I was taught that you never leave anyone behind, that everyone that came in goes out dead or alive. And then when they come home, and the people who taught us leave them laying there, as it were, disregarded and disrespected, that bothers me.
The Need for Speed was produced by Jamie Doran for Atlantic Celtic Films and Studio Hamburg.